Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bob Waller. I'm President and CEO of Association Headquarters. I'm thrilled that you're joining us today for the final session of our third Wednesday E-Series powered by AH Leadership Forum. The overall theme for the sessions this year have been the 3 C's of fostering meaningful connection, that being communication, culture, and collaboration. I'm really excited about today's session, the title of which is How to Drive Culture, Even in a Remote Work Environment. I know many of us will learn a lot, and I know many of us have been working remotely throughout this crazy year we've been living. Now, at the end of the session, we're going to invite you to participate in Remo, which is our interactive platform that we're using. It's a very easy to use platform. You can jump on different tables, participate in discussions with other of the participants. So at the end, we'll have you click on the Join and Networking, which is just under the session screen, to hop on to Remo at the, as I said, the conclusion of the session today. Before we get started, I want to recognize our sponsors. Without these folks, we wouldn't be able to do as much as we have. In the gold category, we have Marriott and Hilton. In the bronze category, Meet AC, and at the friend level, Convention Data Services. And finally, at our family level, Bank of America Merrill Lynch. So again, I want to thank all those folks for their ongoing support of our leadership forum. Let's review a few things. I have a few kind of notes that I need to go over here just to highlight a few things. First of all, feel free to chat with the other attendees using the chat function, which is to the right of the player at the bottom of your screen there. You can submit questions to the speaker just by clicking on Submit Your Question button, and the question will go straight through. We will be muting all the attendees during the session, but again, you can use the question button to submit any questions you have. And lastly, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you can contact events support at imsts.com, or you can just click on the email link located at the bottom of the page, and you'll be connected directly to the support technician. So let me get right to it and introduce our speaker for today. It's my pleasure to introduce certainly a gentleman I've known for many, many years, David Friedman. Prior to founding High Performing Culture, David was the president of RSI, an award-winning employee benefits brokerage and consulting firm that grew to become one of the largest and most successful independently owned agencies in the country. RSI was named one of the best places to work in the region 7 times and was 4 times named one of the fastest growing companies. In 2006, RSI was the only company of any size in an industry to win New Jersey's highest award for quality, the Governor's Award for Performance Excellence, and they received it at the gold level. In 2011, David published his first book, Fundamentally Different, which is based on his insights he learned and taught throughout his leadership career. And in 2018, he published his second book, Culture by Design, the definitive how-to manual for building a high-performing culture. So today, in addition to leading HPC, David does more than 100 workshops and keynote talks annually, sharing his experiences and wisdoms with thousands of leaders across the country. So without any further ado, I want to turn the mic over to David.
It's good to be with everybody. And so we're going to go ahead and get this started. There we go. So we're going to be talking today about driving a high-performing culture even in a remote work environment. And I say even in a remote work environment because, as Bob said, and we all know, we've been living in an alternate reality for the last year. And now with so many people working remotely and hybrid work environments, it's created a whole new level of challenge and stress to how do we manage culture in that kind of environment. So 4 goals for our session today. First is, I want to talk briefly about, well, what the heck is culture? I mean, we all say that it's so important to us. Well, what is it? And why does it even matter? Secondly, we'll talk about, well, how does culture actually happen in any organization, remote or otherwise? Third, we'll talk about, okay, so we understand that. How has it been affected by this world that we've been in where so many people are working remotely or we have these hybrid work environments? And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, what do we do about it? Okay, yeah, that's nice. It's all been affected, but what do we actually do? How can we purposely go about creating in our organizations a really high-performing environment, a high-performing culture, even when people are working remotely? So let's start with, so what is culture? My definition of culture is I say that our culture is the set of principles that govern how people behave in a given context. And notice that I've put this word behave in italics and in red because it is all about behavior. Culture is not about having pizza parties and about having, being able to dress down or bring our dog to work or having a ping pong table in the reception area. Culture is about how do people behave, and I say here in a given context because people actually behave differently in different worlds. Think about, when you're with your high school or college friends, you behave sometimes differently than you do at work, than your church friends or your golfing buddies or whatever. So culture is context specific. So we're going to be talking about how to do that. Now, the reason it really matters is it ultimately affects virtually everything that happens in your organization. Most of you have probably heard this quote before by Peter Drucker, where he said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I've actually heard lunch too. I'm not sure which meal he was talking about. But the point when Peter Drucker said this, what he's really saying is no matter how good your strategy is, you as an organization could have this wonderful, amazing strategy. And if you've got a highly functioning group of people, you're going to take that strategy and you're going to go light years further with it. And if you've got a messed up, dysfunctional group of people, you're not going to get very far. I don't care how good the strategy is. Patrick Lencioni, who many of you have probably read some of his books, talks about the multiplier effect of culture. That, again, regardless of how good your product, service, or strategy may be, you're going to go multiples further when you've got a high-performing group of people, and you're going to go a fraction as far when you've got a dysfunctional group of people. There's a quote that you'll often hear people say when they say that an organization is only as good as its people. And that sounds wonderful, and yet I have a variation on that, because I don't think that's entirely true. See, in my experience, an organization is only as good as its people perform, because the same people will perform differently in different organizations. That you could take your people, and if they left your organization, they went to a competitor, they will perform differently because the environment or the culture that we're in has this enormous influence over how people operate. I think of it that there's the bell curve that I think that exists, that if you think about the people that work in your association, that typically about 5 or 10% of these people are going to be amazing people. I like to call these people rock stars. These are the people that they would be amazing no matter where you put them. You could put them in the worst possible environment and they still stand out because that's just who they are. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got 5 or 10% of your people who I always like to say are going to stink up the joint no matter where you put them. You could put these people in the best environment and they're still not going to be very good because that's just how they are. But in between, and here's the important thing, about 80% of your people will go with the flow. You put those people in a high-performing environment, they're going to look around consciously and unconsciously, and they're going to figure out, well, I guess that's what they do around here. And you take the exact same people with whatever their skills, talent, knowledge, ability, experiences, you take those same people and you put those people in a low-performing environment, and they're going to sink to the level of the people around them because the environment has that much influence over everything that happens. It's what gets people to apply what we call discretionary effort. That people come to work, there's a certain amount of effort they're willing to put in, but put them in a high-performing culture, and it's the difference between them just showing up and putting in their best. It affects everything. It even affects our ability to attract and retain people. So if we understand that, the question is, where does culture come from? Okay, we all know it's really important. It has this enormous influence. Is it just something that like you sprinkle pixie dust on people and somehow magically a culture happens? Or is it actually possible to somehow kind of engineer the culture? And we're going to talk about how you can actually do that. Now, here's an interesting thing. One of my observations is that in every group of people that comes together, whether we're talking about a group of friends, or we're talking about a sports team, or a family, or a company, or an association, that when people come together, a culture forms. And if we don't purposely create it, it mostly will be formed led by the strongest personalities in the group. Think about a group of friends of yours, and you're all getting together and you're getting ready to go out to dinner. And somebody says, well, what time you guys want to meet? And then somebody inevitably stands up and says, how about 6 o'clock? Does that work for everybody? Well, who said 6 o'clock? It was the leader. Every group, there are leaders who emerge, and it's just the nature of their personality that they tend to exert more influence over the culture than everybody else. Now, the reason I point this out is that I would tell you that in your association, in your organizations, that the exact same thing goes on, that if we're not purposeful, we're not intentional, systematic about how we create our culture, how we engineer it, it's going to get created anyway, and it's going to mostly get created or led by or driven by the strongest personalities in the organization. And those people, by the way, aren't necessarily the designated managers, supervisors, and leaders. They're just the people who happen to have strong personalities. And if those people happen to be really positive, enthusiastic, hardworking, quality-oriented kind of people, well, this is going to be great. But if they're not, if some of those strong personalities happen to be cynical jerks with lousy attitudes, and we've all had some of those jerks in our organizations, those jerks are going to influence the people around them to be more like them. And the reason I'm pointing this out, of course, is if we understand how much impact our culture has, that's not something we want to leave to the whims of the strongest personalities and just hope that it's going to somehow magically work out. Instead, we've got to be much more systematic, much more intentional about creating. Now, here's the real issue, that this remote work environment before COVID, think about what it was like. You could set people were around the leaders, and just by example, people could pick up the culture by how the leaders operate. Secondly, people are connecting with each other. They're seeing each other every day. We're in the same office. We're leaning over the workstation and sharing ideas and connecting. And third, there was this interpersonal connection, this bond that gets created when people are together. Now contrast that with this new world where everybody's working remotely or hybrid. So first of all, we're isolated. So we're working from home. We're sitting at the kitchen table in our bedroom or in our apartment. So we're not seeing people other than on Zoom. Secondly, we don't have the same kind of communication. If we're not intentional about communication, how do we make sure that people get the information they need? I can't just lean over the workstation and say, hey, Mary, I just got off the phone with Bob and this is what I learned. So that natural communication doesn't take place. And people feel disconnected. They feel isolated. They feel like they're not part of something anymore in this new world. So the answer to that is that we have to take a new look at our culture, that our culture can't be driven simply by people being together because they're not together. So if we're going to really manage our culture and drive it and expand it in this new world where so many people are working remotely, and by the way, we all know that even when this pandemic is behind us, a whole lot of people are going to still work remotely. So some are coming back to the office, but there are going to be many people who are permanently working from home. So this isn't just a temporary thing we need to deal with. So if we're going to deal with that and we're going to build our culture in an environment where we can't rely on people just seeing each other and being around each other, somehow we've got to be a lot more systematic about it. And what I want to show you is how can you do that? How could you be more systematic in a way that works even when people are working remotely? So I organize the steps that it takes to be really systematic and embed your culture into all of your people in a powerful way. I organize those steps around a framework that you see in front of you on your screen that I call the 8-step framework. 8 different things that when we do these 8 things, this is how you make this happen, even in a remote work environment. And what I want to do is I want to show you very briefly these 8 steps. But what I then want to focus on is my experience tells me that while all of the 8 steps I'm about to show you are important, there are actually 2 of these steps that drive a disproportionate amount of influence over our success. If we do these 2 things well, we're going to be really successful. And if we don't do these 2 things well, we're just not going to get very far. So in the interest of the time we have in this webinar, I want to give you the big picture very briefly and then just do a deeper dive on these two things that drive success the most. So the first of these things is one of the two big ones, the two that are in the middle, is we've got to define more clearly than we've ever done exactly what we want that culture to be, because we're not going to be able to build it successfully and drive it successfully if we don't have enough clarity about what it needs to be. And I'm going to show you a new way to do that. Secondly, we've got to create what I call rituals around how we practice it in order to make it be sustainable. We've all had the experience in our companies and our associations rolling out programs and initiatives, and we were all excited. This is going to be wonderful. And then we got really busy and life got in the way and it all fell by the wayside. And we don't want that to happen. The key to making things last is this very simple and yet very powerful concept that I'm going to show you that I call creating rituals. And these are the two steps that really drive the most. These are the two things that are the biggest drivers. All right, the third step, I call it selecting. And when I talk about selecting, what I'm referring to is how do you pick the right people to be in the organization? And when I'm talking about people that are going to be a good fit, because we're not going to build high-performing associations, high-performing organizations with people who don't fit. We got to get really good at that. The fourth step I call integration. Integration is the word that I use for what many people call orientation, or some people use the new agey term that I hate, onboarding. But whatever word you want to use, it's the word that describes how do we take the people we just hired and how do we bring them into the organization? The reason that, by the way, I use this particular word, integration, is I think it has a different connotation. Like orientation suggests, I'm telling you about us, I'm orienting you to us. Where integration is a word of assimilation. I'm bringing you into the fold, I'm making you a part of who we are. But whatever word you want to use, it doesn't matter. The point is, how you do that has an enormous influence over your culture, enormous. I say to people all the time, if I went to work in any of your associations, organizations, I would tell you that the first week that I spend in your company is just about the most important week in my whole career. This is where people are figuring out, how do things happen around here? You know, these are their first impressions, and those first impressions are lasting. And it's amazing to me how few companies or organizations focus on this. We spend so much time in recruiting to get great people, and then we so often basically throw them to the wolves and say, good luck, let me know if you have any questions. You know, if we spent a fraction of the resources that we spend in recruiting, and we put that back into orchestrating every aspect of a new person's experience, it would have an enormous influence over our culture. Huge opportunity. All right, the fifth step in our overall framework, I call it communicating our culture. And of course, this is more important than ever in this remote time, that we've got to be able to share the culture everywhere in our organization. Now, this is something I want to be very clear about. I'm not talking about putting beautiful signs up with your vision, mission, and values. And we've all seen those successory prints that with the eagle flying and it says leadership, and the people rowing on the river and it says teamwork. And I see this stuff in companies, and then I look at their people and I think, yeah, nobody's doing any of that stuff. So it's not enough to just put signs up, but everywhere I look, I should see and hear things about our culture. The more we're talking about it, the more we're explaining it, the more I am seeing it everywhere around us, the more likely we're thinking about it. Repetition is everything. All right, the sixth step in our framework, I call it coaching. When I talk about coaching, what I'm referring to is how you use the day-to-day situations that come up in your organizations to teach and reinforce your culture. You're going to hear me say this a lot. Your culture isn't the signs on the walls. It's what your people are doing every day. And every day, situations come up. An issue comes up with a member. An issue comes up with a vendor, between two employees or two volunteers. And issues come up, and we're giving them feedback and coaching. Well, every time in that coaching, every time we use the specific language and vocabulary of our culture in that day-to-day coaching, we're pulling it off the wall and we're making it real and relevant and meaningful for people. Lots of opportunities to do that. All right, the seventh step in our overall framework is something everybody knows about, but we still need to talk on it. And that is your own leadership example. In whatever role you play in your association or organization, Your leadership example is telling people what's really important. We could put all the beautiful signs on the walls that we want, but at the end of the day, what you and the other leaders of the organization do, the example they set, tells people more than anything what's really important. And I know we know that, but when you really think about that, you start being really purposeful about everything you're doing. You're about to do something and you think, you know what? Everybody's watching right now. Everybody's listening. What's the message I want to cast out into the world by what we're really doing? You know, as leaders, it's almost like we have a megaphone. You know, everything we say just gets amplified in a big way. And so we got to make sure that we are setting the example that we want people to follow. All right, the eighth and last step in the overall framework, I call it driving or creating accountability for our culture. In other words, how do people understand that we're serious about this, that we're not kidding? Because if there's no accountability for it, it's just a wish. Many different ways we can do that. For example, if we're serious about our culture, we should have elements of our culture built into our performance review system, whatever that looks like in our organization. We can do annual surveys based on our culture. I'll tell you that the biggest example of accountability is actually getting rid of people who don't fit. Almost every organization I've ever seen of every type has at least one person who desperately needs to be fired. They're a pain in the neck. They're opposite of everything we say is really important, and yet they're still here. We talk about them in our management meetings over and over again, and they're still here. You know, when we allow these people to stay in our organizations, we're basically saying to our whole organization, you know what, folks, our culture is really important here. Unless you produce enough business or unless you're hard to replace. And that's what we're saying. I sometimes say it this way. This is kind of blunt, so I apologize for this. But the best way for me to really know the culture of your organization is to look at the behavior that you tolerate. I don't care about the stuff you told me when you hired me. I don't care about the stuff you put on your website. What you allow to go on in your organization, that's the real deal. And when you finally get rid of somebody who's, especially if they're a high performer and they don't fit, they're not living to the culture, you just told the whole company, the whole association that, you know what, folks, we're actually serious about this stuff. And all of a sudden people start getting lined up. And I don't mean to be dwelling on getting rid of people, but ultimately there needs to be some accountability for this. So this is the big picture of the 8-step framework. Then when we do these 8 things, this is how we systematically drive the culture we want, even when we're working remotely. Now, I want to go back and talk about the 2 things that most impact it. And so the first of those is this idea of how we define with more clarity than we've ever done before exactly what we want that culture to be. Because we can't build it if we're fuzzy about what it is the culture we're trying to build in the first place. Now, to do that, I want to offer you a very important language distinction. And this is one of the 2 most important things I could tell you this afternoon. If you get nothing out of this webinar except this one thought, it'll be worth it. And it's a distinction between what I call values and what I call behaviors. And I think that the distinction is really important. It's not just semantics. So let me explain to you what the difference is and why this is important. So a value is typically an abstract concept. It's a notion, an idea. So examples of values are things like integrity and quality, respect, innovation, teamwork, service, loyalty. These are ideas, they're concepts, they're notions. A behavior, in contrast, is an action. It's something I can literally see people do. So some of the behaviors as examples that I teach in my own company, just to give you a flavor, are things like these. Honor commitments. That's something you actually do. Practice blameless problem solving. Be a fanatic about response time. Get clear on expectations. These are actions, things that you do. So a value is an abstract idea, a behavior is an action. In parts of speech, I sometimes think of it like a value is a noun and a behavior is a verb. It's a thing versus an action. Okay? Now, why does any of this matter? Well, here's the issue. The problem with the way most organizations tend to use the traditional looking core values is that they tend to be so abstract that they mean too many different things to different people. I'll give you a really simple example. One of the values that I see in many organizations' list of core values is they'll have the value for respect. We should all respect each other. And it sounds like a wonderful idea. I mean, who would argue with that, especially in these days? But what does that word mean? I mean, it means a lot of different things to different people. If you grew up in an inner city gang, your definition of what it looks like to respect somebody, or perhaps to diss them, could be completely different than what it might mean in your family. Or I think about regional differences. Any of you in the audience who grew up in the Deep South, I'll bet you were raised as children and taught that when you speak to an adult, you call them sir or ma'am. It's disrespectful not to do that. Do that in the Northeast where I live, that's just freaking weird. It had nothing to do with respect at all. You know, we all have different ideas of what the word means. So to simply say one of our core values is respect sounds wonderful, but it's not clear enough. Behaviors, though, because their actions are much easier to teach, to coach, to give people feedback about. It's very difficult to coach people about their values. It's much easier to coach them about their behaviors. So this is an example of what I mean by a description of a behavior. So I mentioned before, one of the examples in my own company, we call it practice blameless problem solving. And then we create a definition that describes, well, what exactly does that mean? And this would be a typical definition of what does it mean to do that? So what I'm suggesting is that we define our culture not by listing 4 broad nebulous core values, but rather by defining a very specific set of behaviors that bring a lot more clarity to what is it that you actually want people to do. And so typically I create for my own company a card that looks like this that has a list of all of those behaviors on it. So once we've got real clarity about that, that's great. Okay, now we're in a lot better position. We've got clarity. But the goal isn't just clarity. The goal is to get this to actually live in our people. And we do that through this concept that I call creating rituals. So this is the second big concept. If you get nothing out of today except these 2 thoughts, behaviors and what I call rituals, you're going to be a lot better off. So what's a ritual? What do I mean by that? A ritual is some behavior, some routine that we do over and over and over again until it becomes baked in. It's just automatic. Simple examples of rituals are things like, we go to a ball game and what happens? We do the national anthem. You get up in the morning and you brush your teeth. Some people before a meal, they say a prayer. When I was a kid in school, we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance. They're just routines. They're just part of the way we operate. Now, the reason that rituals are so powerful is that most humans, and by extension organizations, because they're only made up of humans, that most people aren't very good at sticking with things. We come up with all kinds of great initiatives, whether it's the personal diet and exercise program that we know we're going to stick to, and then we fall off the wagon. Or I mentioned before, the programs we roll out at work that we're all excited about, that we're sure are going to make a difference, and then life gets in the way and we get a big customer, we lose a customer, we have a new employee, an employee leaves, and we get busy and it all falls by the wayside. Well, when something becomes a ritual, it's no longer difficult to do. It just keeps going over and over and over again because it's just baked in. When I mentioned before the example of brushing our teeth in the morning, most of us don't struggle to try to remember to brush our teeth. You just wake up in the morning and it's just part of your routine. When something becomes a ritual, it's no longer hard. It's just what we do. So here's how we use this concept. We take these rituals, these behaviors, and by the way, I give behaviors a name. I call them fundamentals. It's just my name for a behavior because I think they're fundamental to success. And we focus on one of them each week. I call it a fundamental of the week. So you introduce it into your organization, and week number 1, everybody in the organization all week long is thinking about, working on, talking about, practicing, focusing on fundamental number 1. Again, that's the behavior. The week after that, all week long, through a series of rituals, everybody's focused on number 2. And the week after that, number 3 and 4 and 5 and so on. And we do that over and over and over and over again until it eventually sinks in. So what do we mean by a ritual? Let me give you an example of what I'm referring to. So this is something that I do in my own company, and actually most of the companies that I work with. So in my company, Every time we have a meeting in our company this week, doesn't matter what kind of meeting it is, project team meeting, department meeting, Zoom meeting, so we can do this, online. This remote is fine. Every time we have a meeting in my company this week, the first agenda item of the meeting is the fundamental of the week. And we spend the first 3 or 4 or 5 minutes talking about it. What does it mean? How do we practice it? So let me give you an example. In my own company, my company's fundamental this week is one that we call check the ego at the door. I have seen this over and over again, that the biggest cause of dysfunction in organizations is always ego. When people are worried about who looks good or who looks bad or who's getting credit and all that garbage, instead of just trying to do whatever's going to make the most sense. So our fundamentals check the ego at the door this week. So every meeting in my company this week, anywhere there's a meeting going on, the first thing we do is we spend 3 or 4 minutes talking about check the ego at the door. How can we do that? What gets in the way? What makes it harder to do? Was there a good example of it? And then we move on with the rest of the meeting. We don't want to take over the meeting, but every meeting all week long starts with that week's fundamental. Next week, we're on to the next fundamental, and every meeting starts with that one. So this is what I mean by a ritual. So there are a number of different rituals we create to do that. And think about this, again, let's go back to this remote work environment. That's just as effective when working remotely. We have a Zoom meeting, and the first thing we do, the first agenda item is the fundamental of the week. So this is easy to do in a remote work environment. So this is what I mean by creating rituals. There's one of the things that I've created in my own company is actually a mobile app that is also really effective when people are working remotely. And every day the remote app sends to people a reminder, we call it a quick tip, with some thought about this week's fundamental and how to practice it, and has videos and coaching tips and teaching points. But my point is, it's simply an engagement tool. It's a way of engaging people, even when they're working remotely, every single day, thinking about this week's fundamental. And so the idea is that if we can focus on that over and over and over again, it starts to sink in. So if I were to really distill what I've been saying to you to one simple concept, here's what it would be. If we want to learn anything so totally, so completely that we've internalized it, whether we want to learn, I put this graphic up, if you want to learn to be an amazing piano player and be a concert pianist, or you want to learn to speak another language fluently, or you want to learn to be a master cabinet maker, anything you want to be really, really good at, what do you have to do to get good at something? You got to practice it a lot, over and over and over again. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, many of you may have read, he talks about the 10,000 hours that he says that it takes of focused repetition in order to really master something. And according to his research, that's true, whether that 10,000 hours was done in a 3-year career or a 40-year career. It takes about 10,000 hours of repetition and real focus to really master something. And honestly, I have no idea if he's right. Maybe it's 9, maybe it's 12, but the point's still valid. The only way I'm ever going to master something is through tremendous amounts of repetition. So here's the key question. If we all understand that the only way we're going to master something is through all this repetition and practice, how many people do you know who love to do repetition and practice? Not any. We get bored, we get distracted. Oh, do I got to keep practicing? It's painful. Well, that's kind of a big problem. If the only way we're going to master something is through tremendous amounts of focused practice and repetition, except most people hate doing practice and repetition, that's kind of a big problem. So what's the key to really being able to do all that in that practice? Well, the key to being able to do all that practice is this concept of rituals. Think about once something becomes a ritual, it's no longer hard to do. Think about brushing your teeth, the national anthem, the Pledge of Allegiance, all the routines that we have. The ritual is I think of it like the platform or the structure that enables the repetition to keep going. In the absence of it being a ritual, we're going to get bored and distracted and quit. Once it becomes a ritual, it's easy to keep it going because it's just baked in. It's just what we do. So the ritual is the platform that's necessary in order to keep the repetition going, and the repetition is what's necessary to internalize something. So let's apply this thought very directly to your culture. And by the way, when I use this word ritual, I think of it almost interchangeable with the word habit. There are a couple of big bestsellers out there. The Power of Habit, some of you may have read. There's another big book called Atomic Habits, another bestseller. It's the exact same concept. Once something becomes a habit, a routine, a ritual, it's no longer difficult to do. It's just what we do. So let's apply this thought very directly to your culture. If you want to drive and embed a culture into your organization, whether they're working in person or remotely, doesn't really matter. The only way people are really going to internalize the behaviors that drive success in your association and your organization is when you teach it to them with enough repetition. They're not going to internalize the behaviors simply because you held a big company meeting for the whole association and told everybody, here's what they are. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do that, but that's not going to be enough for them to internalize it. They're not going to internalize it because it's in their performance reviews. They're not going to internalize it because you put it on your website or you put signs on the walls. The only way people are going to internalize those behaviors is when we teach it to them over and over and over and over and over again. And the only way we're ever going to teach it to them with that much repetition, once again, without getting bored, distracted, and quitting, is when we create the rituals around it. That's why rituals are so foundational to success. So I want to share with you a quote that is my favorite quote on the topic of culture. And the quote says, good companies, and we can say this about associations as well, good associations have good cultures by chance. But world-class companies or world-class associations have world-class cultures by design. And what I mean when I say that good companies have good cultures by chance, what I'm suggesting is if you who are listening to this, if you are good leaders and your association has good leaders, you're mostly going to do most of the right stuff. This isn't rocket science. You're going to hire people who are good people who are kind of like you, even if it isn't a big strategy, it just happens on its own. And you're going to treat them reasonably well, not because you read a book one day that said you should treat your people well. I mean, what else are you going to do? You're going to do that naturally. And if you do that, you're going to have a pretty decent culture. You're going to be fine. You're not going to fail. What I talk about, and what we've been sharing this afternoon, isn't the difference between success and failure. I mean, how could I claim it is? Many of you have been successful and you probably haven't been doing this. This isn't the difference between success and failure. This is the difference between being successful and being extraordinary, because that's an entirely different game. That while good companies have good cultures by chance, the best organizations understand just how important their culture is to success, and so they don't leave any of it to chance. It's just too important. And in this new remote work environment where we can't rely anymore on just the luck of people being around each other and picking up the vibe and somehow getting a sense of it, we've got to be a lot more systematic about it. And if we want to be systematic, again, I'll come back to this 8-step framework. I like to think of the framework sort of this way, that the 6 steps around the outer rim, I sometimes call these incremental, meaning we could look at how we're doing at selecting the best people to join our group, and we could make incremental improvements to get better at that. And we could look at our integration program in whatever form it may exist today, and we can make incremental improvements to get better and so on. But these 2 things in the middle, I don't think are incremental. If we don't start by defining exactly what we want that culture to be, and I say define it in behavioral terms, we're not going to get very far. We must have absolute clarity about exactly what we want that culture to be. Secondly, just go back to that last illustration I was showing. The only way our people are ever going to internalize those behaviors is when we teach it to them over and over and over and over and over again. And the only way we're ever going to teach it to them with that much consistency without getting bored and distracted and quitting is when we create the rituals around it. That's why I say those 2 steps ultimately are the most important steps. We've got to define what we want the culture to be, and then we've got to begin to build the rituals around it so that we have something that we get this repetitious practice over and over and over again. And when we do that, these things begin to become internalized by our people. So that's the easiest way to do that. And again, notice that if we think about that concept, even when our people are working remotely. So my company is all remote. We have no physical office. All my people are remote. And we practice our fundamentals every single week. And we do them in our Zoom calls. We do them on the mobile app. We talk about them all the time. We focus on one fundamental every week, and we keep cycling through them, and they become embedded in our people, even when we're working remotely. So if there was something I'd want you to keep in mind, it's, again, this idea that when people were physically together, we were able to get away with, it wasn't the best way, but you were still able to get away with just hoping people would kind of pick up the vibe by example. But now with our people working remotely, we have to be way more systematic than we've ever been if we're not going to be at risk of losing our culture in this new environment. And the way to do that is this 8-step framework, and in particular, behaviors and rituals. So let me stop it there, and Bob will join me, and we're happy to take questions that anybody's got on anything that I've talked about or other challenges that you may be facing.
Well, David, first of all, thank you. This is a fantastic session. We did receive a few questions. I guess first off, I'm going to jump in with mine. I guess, you and I have known each other a long time, and I know that,
Yes.
culture has always been extremely important to you, and just having had the opportunity to visit RSI and see it in practice. What got you kind of focused on culture, way back early in your career?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when Bob talks about RSI was my first company, it was an employee benefits consulting company. That's where Bob and I got to know each other. And it's where I developed this whole concept. And, it's interesting, when I look back in that, I didn't know it as culture originally. Where it came from was, we were building our company, and I have very high standards, like I know you do, Bob, for myself and everybody around me. And I knew that the only way I could get people to play at the level that I wanted to play is I had to be clear about, well, what did I expect? And I had to teach people over and over again the way that I wanted us to operate. And so I figured I better articulate this stuff and start teaching it. And I wasn't thinking of it back then as culture. I was just thinking about, I want people to do things in a certain way. It was only in retrospect that I thought, well, I guess that's really what culture is. Now, one piece I would add to this is, in my early days, I was maybe less formal about that. And the idea of these behaviors and rituals and what we call fundamentals actually came from an experience I had with the Ritz-Carlton hotel chain. So Ritz-Carlton has 20 basics that are behaviors they teach. They call their basics, and they have them on a little laminated card. And there was an experience where I took my staff off-site once to the Ritz-Carlton in Center City, Philadelphia, to learn about great service. And they taught us about this, and this is where I got this idea. So Ritz-Carlton has these 20 behaviors called their basics. They're on a little laminated card, and every day they focus on one through what they call a daily lineup. So every day, team members in a hotel get together at the beginning of their shift in every department, every shift all day long, and they have a brief 10 or 12-minute meeting called a daily lineup. And the first thing they talk about in their daily lineup is what they call their basic of the day. So today is day number 1, tomorrow is 2, next day is 3, et cetera. At the end of 20 days, they go back to the beginning and they repeat that cycle over and over again. And I learned that many years ago, and I thought that was just so powerful that I thought, how could I do something like that in my company? And I went home and I created our first set of fundamentals, and I decided we would do a weekly ritual, and the rest was history. But it came from learning that at Ritz-Carlton.
It's funny. I was going to mention that because I do remember you telling me that story about Ritz-Carlton. So a couple of the questions here. What kinds of questions or resume items do you look for to screen folks that will fit in your culture?
Great question. So when we're trying to screen for culture, first thing I would say is that what we want to do is, we can't screen for our culture if we don't know what we want our culture to be. And so it's why I keep coming back to the clarity of definition. If the notion of our culture is this vague sense of, well, we're really nice people and we try to work hard, and there's nothing more definitive, well, how do you know who's a good fit in that? So it starts with the clarity of being able to say, these are the behaviors that drive our culture, the fundamentals as I call them. Now, when we do that, we can write interview questions around those fundamentals that test for, does somebody have this? When we're writing those interview questions, we always want to write questions that are behavioral based. We don't want to ask somebody, so, what do you think about this? Yeah, they're all going to say they think it's good. We want to ask stories and examples. And ideally, we want to ask questions that don't necessarily reflect exactly what we're looking for. So let me give you a simple example. If I were looking for somebody, let's say in your association, teamwork is a really important thing. And I'm looking for people who really are team-oriented kind of people. I'm not going to ask them, so do you like working on teams? Yeah, they're going to say yes. Instead, here's one of my favorite questions. I would ask them a question like this. In your last job, tell me about a situation where you were really proud of something that you accomplished. Like, what was a project you worked on or whatever that you were really proud of? Tell me about that. What was the story? Now, I didn't ask them about teamwork. If the story they choose to tell me is they say, we had this situation where I was finally able to just work on my own, and I wasn't dependent upon anybody else. I was in total control of the project, and it was so much fun. It was so rewarding. I created this amazing thing. They may be a wonderful person, but they're probably not that team oriented. If the story they choose to tell me is, I got to tell you this, we were on this team, and it was a cross-functional team. And it brought in people from all different departments of our organization. And it was just amazing the way people gelled. And we came up with this incredible project and we rolled it out. Well, they're probably more likely a team-oriented person. Now, again, I didn't ask them a yes or no question. I want stories and examples. And I didn't ask them if they like teams. But the story they choose to tell reveals a lot about who they really are as people. So, short version of the answer to your question is, define your fundamentals, write behavioral questions around the fundamentals, and ask for stories and examples that illustrate the things that are important to them. And through that, they reveal who they really are as people.
Thank you, David. I've got a couple more questions here.
Sure.
Let's see. Board member, usually when people are fired from an organization, the backstory is kept pretty confidential. How does the notion that someone was let go because they did not participate in the culture get communicated to the other staff appropriately?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first thing I would say is that it needs to be confidential. That personnel things are confidential. You can't go out and shouldn't go out to everybody and say, hey, we fired Bob because he was a jerk. You don't want to do that. Now, having said that, this is really, well, maybe with somebody like Bob. But so here's what I found. So when I talk about this issue with leaders, and I do this all the time, I'll ask people, I'll describe that person who's a pain in the neck and they need to be fired, and everybody's nodding their head, and I'll ask the leaders, how many of you in the room finally, have ever had the experience of firing one of those people? And most leaders will raise their hand. Yeah, I've done that. And then I asked them, I said, when you did, what did everybody else say? And almost in unison, the audience will say, it's about time. Thank God. We were wondering when you were going to do this. So they get it.
What
It's
took you
not a
so
secret.
long, right?
They've been waiting for you to do this. This isn't a mystery to them. So we don't have to tell them. We shouldn't, again, because it's confidential, but they know it. Interestingly, when I asked the leaders, what did you say to yourself afterwards? Almost in unison, they say, I should have done this a long time ago. So they know this. It's just, we all struggle with it. And yet, here's an interesting thing about this too. When we don't fire that person, there's actually an unintended consequence of that. And the unintended consequence is we make vulnerable some of our very best people. Here we are protecting this person who's I call them the terrorist. And some of our very best, wonderful people are watching this saying, you know what? If that's the kind of stuff that's okay here, I think I'll just leave. I'll go somewhere else. And we don't appreciate that that's what we're risking that while we're not dealing and confronting this person who really shouldn't be here. So they know it is the short answer.
Under your 8 steps framework, you certainly mentioned that integration is so important. What are a few steps or a few pieces of that you would recommend be part of anyone's integration, whether it's a volunteer leader to a board or committee, or certainly hiring someone as a staff person?
Yeah, great question. In all of those situations, how people are brought on board, even I'm being brought on as a board member, how I'm integrated into the organization is really important because it colors the way I view everything. if you leave it to my own devices to sort of figure out my way, who knows what conclusions I come to. So we want to orchestrate that. When we orchestrate that, a couple things I would say briefly. First thing is that we want to be consistent. We want to make sure every person we bring in, whether it's a board member, employee, whoever it is, that we are always taking them through integration. And I would rather a company or an organization have a 2-hour integration that they do every single time without fail than an amazing, incredible, 3-week process that they did once or twice and stopped doing. So consistency is key. I think there are 3 things that every integration should include, even if it's just 2 hours. The first is culture. Somebody has to explain to me, I'm a new person in this organization, somebody has to sit eyeball to eyeball with me, or even on a Zoom call, and explain to me what is the culture here. Not hope I figure it out, or not just hand me an 8.5 by 11 with the vision, mission, and values, but somebody's got to teach it to me. So that's the first thing. Second thing I have to learn is what I call context. When I talk about context, what I mean is, how do I fit into the larger picture of what we do here? If I'm an employee, what's my job, and how does my job connect to everybody else? That could be as simple as an organizational chart, and maybe you highlight in yellow my role and help me to understand how I connect to the people around me. And the reason I say this is important is if you hire me or bring me onto the board and you stick me in the corner and just tell me to do my job, you're going to limit my contribution. The more I understand of the big picture of what we do and how I fit in and how I contribute, the greater my potential contribution. So the second thing is I have to understand the context. The third thing is what I call logistics. There are certain basic logistics for how we work around here. And these are simple things that we don't tell people. Like, what's the combination for the back door? How do you work our voicemail system? Who do you talk to if you need new business cards? What happens if my computer doesn't work? How do you work the photocopy machine? I mean, these are simple logistical things, but the longer it takes people to understand these, the longer it takes till they feel comfortable, relaxed, and are starting to contribute. So a simple way, by the way, you can address this, and that is you go to the last 5 people you brought on board and you ask them a simple question. Name 3 things that you wish somebody told you on the first day and they didn't. And they will tell you, oh, nobody told me this, nobody told me that. You make a list of that, and then you sit down with new people and you explain it. You don't just type it up and send it to them, but you sit down and you explain those things. So if we think of these 3 categories, culture, I got to learn the culture. Context, I have to understand how I fit into the larger picture of what we do. Third is logistics. What are the basic things I need to know to get along and work here? If we start there very simply, and we address those 3 categories, even if it was just a 1 or 2 hour session, but we did that every single time. And every time we go through integration, we at least make 1 iterative improvement from the time before it. What went well? What can we do better next time? Eventually, we develop a really world-class kind of integration program. But that's a simple framework to think about how to do that.
And again, very applicable to, bringing on new volunteer leaders, either on a board level or committee level. Very, very similar
Absolutely.
type of process. So, all right, we have time for one more question. As a volunteer leader, it can be difficult to face a peer who is being disruptive to the culture. How do leaders start on the path to making a change?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I would say that when I look at organizations, whether they be nonprofits, for-profits, associations, groups of humans, my observation is that the single biggest cause of most people's struggles is communication. That we don't communicate very effectively. We blame it on a lot of other things, but ultimately, if we were better at how we communicate, we would solve most of our problems. There are 2 fundamentals that I teach in my own company and most of our clients that deal very directly. There's several, but 2 in particular deal directly. One I call speaking straight, which is about having honest, clear, direct conversations. The other is what we call listening generously. You can't get people to have honest conversations if we're not good listeners. So we've got to create an environment. The starting point is to create an environment in which it's safe to have honest conversations with each other, where it is not only safe, but it's expected. In other words, it's not okay to keep your mouth shut. If you've got something that you need to say to somebody, we need to be able to do that, and you need to have the courage to do that. And third, we need to teach people the skills to do that. Because to be fair, if I create an environment in which I say it's safe to have honest conversations and it's expected, and you don't have good skills for how to do that, and then you go talk to that person who's not on the program and you try to have an honest conversation, they bite your head off and it doesn't go well, all you're going to learn is, I'm never doing that again. That stuff doesn't work. I don't know what they were talking about. And so we don't want to do that. So we've got to prepare people to do that. But the answer to the question is, we have to have the skills in the environment to go directly to that person and have an honest, productive, helpful conversation. And honest doesn't mean just dumping on them. Hey, you're a big jerk. You got to be different. Honest means clear, direct, but helpful. And so there's a skill set to be developed around how to have those conversations. But ultimately, it comes down to communication. We've got to be able to do that. There's a quote that I heard recently about having clear and honest conversations. And the author said, I like the way she said this. She said, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. We're not doing anybody any favors by avoiding the difficult conversation or beating around the bush or not being clear with them. It's actually unkind to them as well as it is to the organization. So the real answer to that question is, we have to be able to go directly to that person and have a clear, honest, direct conversation about what we're observing and what we need to say. And we have to create environments where it's safe and expected, and we're skillful at doing that. That's a high-performing culture.
Yeah, you had mentioned the coaching piece as important as part of your 8 steps. And obviously all the things you just highlighted, from my perspective, would fall into more of the coaching approach. Again,
Absolutely.
Whether you're a volunteer serving on a board of directors or certainly a manager and working with the individuals who report to you. So, David, thank you again. This was fantastic. A lot of great takeaways.
Totally my pleasure.
So I thank you for your time. And I want to thank everybody who participated today, and for those of you that submitted your questions. Again, we're going to get David's slides from him and make those available to everyone, so you'll have an opportunity to get those. One comment: please stay tuned for information on Leadership Forum 2021. We're beginning to put the program together, and we'll be getting information out to you shortly to at least get the dates on your calendar. So now I want to invite you to join us in the Remo platform. If you click on the Join Network button at the bottom of the player there, you'll be able to access that platform. So again, I want to thank you all for your participation today, and please continue to stay safe. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye now.